So I'm going to talk about the first incident that occurred and my father's ultimate death. I have the police reports here, as I showed you if you watched the first video. And what I've done is taken notes from it so that I could really pull out the timeline effectively. And I'm going to read by those notes and kind of give you some flavor in between so that you know the background of what was going on in the house and what my mother's behaviors, practices, that kind of thing were. So when the police arrived at the house, my stepfather was being worked on by the paramedics. He was not dead yet. And there was two officers. The first one was just a regular officer, and the second one was an investigator, I guess a detective. He arrived on the scene an hour and 15 minutes after the original officer. My mother began painting a story for the police officers as soon as they got there to give them some background, to make it look like he was suicidal and mentally unstable. She told them that he had a fractured skull and a concussion from a fall that happened on November 6, 1976 at the Top Draw Super Club. It's a nightclub restaurant in Miami that we were there for dinner. I was there for dinner. It was my aunt, her boyfriend, who was my stepfather's business partner, who came into our lives through my mother, my grandparents, and my brother. I was 11 at that time. My brother would have been 16. She said he got the concussion and everything from a fall, spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and then placed into a psych ward for 2 weeks. What wasn't documented in the police report, what she didn't share with them, was that he was actually in a coma for 2 weeks prior to the psych ward. And I don't know anything about the psych ward. I don't know that that's actually where he was for 2 weeks. I do know that my mother drove me to a parking lot, pointed out a window in a building and said that he was up there in that room and that it was a crazy ward, is what she told me, that he wasn't right in the head. And that was kind of a standard practice for my mother. Like, she would tell me that our family thought I was crazy in the head from the time I was like 9 and 10 years old. This is a gaslighting thing, a manipulation that is attached to someone who has narcissistic traits. My mother was a narcissist, is a narcissist, and a sociopath, by the way. I guess I should have mentioned that. What she didn't share with the police regarding the incident at the Top Draw Supper Club. So that night when we were there for my aunt's birthday, my mother insisted on my grandparents driving my brother and I home and dropping us off, because my grandparents, wanted to leave right after dinner. They're older, that whole sort of thing. My stepfather said, well, why are you doing that? Like, they can stay. We'll just take them home with us. Normally, when we were at dinner together, no matter what it was for, my brother and I stayed till the end and always went home with my mother and my stepfather. My grandparents never took us separately. Like, this was a real one-of occasion. They drove us home, and in the morning, I was sitting in my brother's room watching TV quietly. He had a TV, I didn't. And the phone rang. I picked up the phone, and there was a woman on the other end questioning me about my stepfather, kind of putting me in a bit of a panic because I didn't have the answers. I didn't know who this person was. And my brother grabbed the phone from me and sent me out of the room. So obviously he knew what was happening. My father was laying in a coma in the hospital. And why this information wasn't given, I don't know. My mother was asleep in her room. So her husband is injured. He's in a coma, and she's home. And she's not home because she has to watch our children. My brother is 16. We had a live-in housekeeper at that time. We had supervision. So I don't know why she's home. I don't know why she left the hospital. I'll never know why. I'll tell you what I do know, though. That night when my stepfather went out to get the car and my aunt and my mother stayed behind in the restaurant, his business partner also went outside with him. Two men drove up in a black sedan. They beat him with baseball bats. And whether it was the blow that caused the fracture or the landing on the pavement is pretty irrelevant. What's relevant is that he ended up in a coma. He lost hearing in one ear and spent 4 weeks at least in one hospital and maybe in a psych ward. And the very next day after my mother woke up and, we got it all together for the day, and she sort of half explained that Daddy was in the hospital. It's going to be okay. We'll go see him soon. We didn't go to see him. Not that day. We went to a pool at the Fontainebleau where we had a cabana. And my aunt was there, her boyfriend, the business partner, mother's friend, in a bathing suit. I was there, my brother was there, and I didn't understand. I didn't understand why we weren't at the hospital. I'm 11 years old. I'm worried about my daddy. And the business partner comes up to me and he says, I really tried to help your father. He's going to be okay. I'm so sorry. I tried to defend him. Well, at 11 years old, I'm smart enough to look him up and down and realize immediately that he's lying to me. He didn't have a scratch on his body, not a bruise, not a scratch, nothing. He was in a bathing suit, and I took real notice in a very conscious way because I was thinking, really? You don't look like you tried to help my daddy. At 11 years old, I said nothing, but I did note it. Of course, my mother left out everything surrounding that. She left out the part where these men attacked my father. She didn't tell any part of that story. And while they said in this police report that they were going to include that report within it, all they have there is the numbers of it. They don't actually attach it, which tells me that the police officer likely never really read it because maybe they just bought my mother's version and wanted to close the whole thing out. I can't speak to what their state of mind was. I will say that as I read this to you, I hope that you will notice what I do, and that is that this was really bad police work. They acted in a way in their own hand that shows that they weren't really taking this case seriously. So my mother tells the police that because of the incident, their marriage started to suffer. That she had called the police on several occasions because she was afraid of my stepfather, because he became violent. I do remember one time when the police were called and they took him away on a stretcher, and I can only assume that time they put him in the psych ward. He came home that same night. So was he violent? I don't think so. I never saw a mark on my mother. I never felt afraid of him. I never saw him be violent with anything or anyone, with the exception of one time when he pulled the phone off of a kitchen wall because she was threatening to take me away, which was her standard practice. So when they would have arguments and fights, and they were usually related to money and her criminal activity, she would immediately start to grab me and try to take me away. And because I was his stepchild, he didn't have a legal right to me. And he did stand in protection of me during the time that he was my father. So that was a button that she identified and that she leveraged. One of the fights that they consistently had, I would hear them when I was laying in my bedroom at night. I would hear the words, their bedroom was right across from mine, was that he wanted her to stop selling used cars with the odometers turned back. He wanted her criminal activity to stop. He was concerned that they would end up being arrested, that he would lose his business licenses. He was very upset with her. And he was more upset with regard to who her two business partners were, who, by the way, did end up getting arrested, and one went to jail for 30 years. That's how many charges were against him in relationship to this criminal enterprise they had going. He used to tell my mother, I do not want these men in the house. I do not want you affiliated with them. I can't maybe control that, but they will not be around my daughter. They will not be around Marnie. You will not have them near her. My stepfather had gone on a business trip, although she claims he wasn't working after the accident. He went on a business trip, and my mother allowed one of these men to stay in our guest room. my father found out and he lost the plot. So yeah, of course you're going to be angry and you're going to be reactive, but being angry and being reactive doesn't equal being violent. She told the police also that he had developed diabetes because of the head injury, and that can happen. However, in 2 places, both of his doctors very clearly state that the brain injury was mild. And so normally when that happens, if somebody develops type 2 diabetes as a result, I'm not a doctor, but I did my research, as a result of a head injury, it's usually a more significant head injury. I'm not saying it couldn't have happened. However, it's unlikely. And the thing that shows that it's not true, and if you lie about one thing, you lie about other things, is that when they looked and found the empty pill bottles that were in the bedroom, one of them was for something called Oronase, which is a diabetes medication. And remember, this assault happened, or let me remind you, in 1976. The Oronase prescription bottle was labeled 1975. So clearly his diabetes predates. Why she would lie about this, I don't know, but she did. Now let's get into the timeline. And as this has gone very long, I'm going to start the timeline in the next part. So that will be part 3. If you haven't already, please take a moment and subscribe so you can see when it pops up.